Hello, my friends. It is Thursday, January 16th, 2025. And this is three big stories. And I have three big stories, and they're all tied together by a common theme. And that theme comes from a video that we're going to see. Rosenberg of the BBC has done a great job collating things from the Soviet, or sorry, I said the Soviet, but it's interesting, the Russian newspaper yesterday, and he was talking about how Russia's kind of trying to reclaim or regenerate the former Soviet Union. So listen to these stories, and then you're going to hear him talk and think, is that actually happening, or am I just off in la la land? Let's get into the first big story right now. Zelensky stated that the U.S., Hungary, Slovakia, and Germany oppose Ukraine joining NATO. Okay, let's roll back the clock. It was 2008, and it was George Bush who was actually kind of pushing for Ukraine to join NATO. I think it was 2008. Yeah, about 2008, 9, something along those lines. It was George Bush that was involved in doing that. And it was Germany and maybe I think France secondarily, but Germany particularly was in opposition to Ukraine joining NATO. Now, move the clock forward. It's now the U.S. and Germany, the U.S. under Biden, and potentially the U.S. under Trump. It doesn't seem like Trump has an appetite for Ukraine becoming part of NATO, but that might change. We just don't know what Trump's going to do one way or another. And some of you say that, well, you keep apologizing for Trump or trying to, shoo this away, or, no, it's not. You just can't tell. Trump doesn't have an ideological core like most politicians that are, on the right or on the left. They're reliably going one way or another. Trump just doesn't. We just don't know. Okay. So he also said that Ukraine spent $100 billion on the war in 2024, with $40 billion from Ukraine itself, $35 billion from the US, and $25 billion from the EU. He also mentioned that Ukraine is in talks with key international partners like France and Poland about the possibility of deploying peacekeepers. Now, that's something that Putin is certainly not going to like, the idea of peacekeepers from other Western powers that are adversaries in Putin's mind on the border with Russia. He won't want that at all. But let's go back to this beginning: U.S., Hungary, and Slovakia and Germany. Okay, let's talk about Slovakia and Hungary. It looked like Hungary was just the core adversary in Europe, but Slovakia has really picked up the pace here. Okay, Zelensky on Slovak PM Fico's Rhetoric. That's Fico, told me that we need to understand where the evil is in the war between Russia and Ukraine. I'm not sure exactly what he meant by that. Like, the evil's clearly over there in Russia, but he doesn't seem to see it that way. So Zelensky said, I said, you can't forgive a murderer. I asked, they shot at you. Why didn't you forgive the murderer? Why arrest the person who shot at you? Well, that's a good question, and it's somewhat revealing the double standard that was there. Here, you'll see the actual phrase here. I told him that it's not possible to forgive the killer, and I think it should be a common position. And then I said, he was shot at. Why didn't you apologize? Why did they arrest someone who fired on you? Well, that's a really good question, and that kind of thing keeps happening all the time. In the early days of the war, I saw a woman on the news. This was when the news actually still covered the war in Ukraine before they kind of lost interest. But she was saying, look, if I hit a person with a car and then fled the scene, they would arrest me. But like, if I ran a red light and I hit a person, they would come and arrest me. Putin's doing all this stuff to all of us and killing people left and right, and nothing's happening to him. It's a really good point. And so justice needs to be served. Okay, big story number 2, the Chinese and Russians. This is Anton Gurushenko. Lavrov spokesperson Maria Zakharova spoke Chinese as she asked tourists from Russia to come celebrate the Chinese New Year in Moscow on state TV. Can anyone tell me how good her pronunciation is? It looks like Russia is entering into a new geopolitical reality. That connection between Russia and China is getting stronger and stronger. And again, just like the connection between Russia and North Korea or the connection between Russia and Iran, the Trump administration is going to frown on these stronger and stronger connections, especially with China. Okay, we do not know if Lavrov, Medvedev, and company are already learning Chinese, but there are certainly preparations underway for ever closer Russian integration with China. In 2023, the demand for Chinese language courses in Russia skyrocketed by 600%. Russian universities are introducing Chinese language learning en masse. And in 2025, 2 times more schools in Moscow and St. Petersburg will offer Chinese as a second language. Employees of the Russian central bank are now obligated to learn Chinese. How about that? Okay. Putin himself said that younger members of his family have been fluent in Chinese. So we're going to listen to Maria Zakharova. The sound is echoey, so it's not me doing that. It's not my microphone. It's just an echoey video. But let's hear what she has to say.
Рада встрече с новыми друзьями. И в этой связи я хотел бы к ним обратиться по-китайски. 邀请大家来到莫斯科一起庆祝中国春节。我们欢迎中国游客。
Okay, now I'm not going to make fun of anybody's pronunciation of anything. That would be quite hypocritical, but that she's trying to do this is showing just how connected these two countries are. Okay, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, and Russia present a much greater long-term threat than T groups. This is according to Michael Casey, the director of National Counterintelligence and Security Center. Wow. Okay, the threat from Russia and China looms larger than ever as spyware technology proliferates worldwide. Casey stressed the urgent need for the government and industry to bolster cybersecurity defenses against these nation states whose actions could significantly harm U.S. critical infrastructure. Our guess is that it's there and it's lying dormant right now. Like just like the pagers and the walkie-talkies with the Israel and Hamas, and the U.S. seems to think that they may very well be in a war with China by 2027. All other things being equal, if China keeps going down a particular path. Casey also highlighted the rapid rise of spyware firms and their accessibility to governments, criminal groups, and ransomware operators. So that's something to keep your eye on. Okay. Now, third big story is that NATO has announced Operation Baltic Sentry, a large naval deployment into the Gulf of Finland to protect undersea cables and other infrastructure from Russian sabotage. Baltic Sentry will include the deployment of NATO warships. Okay, so now it's a NATO thing, not just a Finland seizing the ship or Estonia patrolling around the cable. It's ramped up significantly. So I don't think this is what Putin wanted by doing this. I don't think he wanted Finland and Sweden to be joining NATO, like by invading Ukraine. So this is kind of a backfiring effect for his actions. But he keeps doing these things that cause backfire because, and here's the big story, okay, the USSR may come back to life this year, according to the newspaper. Steve Rosenberg from the BBC does these great videos. We're going to listen to some of this. It cannot be ruled out that this year Ukraine will cease to exist. So let's start about here.
Hardline view of things. The headline here, Patrushev warning that it cannot be ruled out that this year Ukraine will cease to exist. An unsubtle hint from Moscow to Ukraine and to Washington that they should agree to Russia's conditions for ending the war, including accepting that Russia isn't going to hand back any of the territory it has seized and occupied in Ukraine. Patrushev says it is important that the world recognizes that the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, Crimea and Sevastopol, have become part of the Russian Federation. He claims that outright Russophobia is destroying once prosperous Ukrainian cities like...
You know, Russophobia is a funny term because it means that they hate these guys. It actually means that they're afraid of them. But there would be a good reason to either hate or be afraid of Russians right now if you were in Ukraine because of what Russia's doing. So it's them destroying it. Well, you know, from the time that you cross the border, they've had this reaction, this allergic reaction to you. You wonder why. Okay.
Kharkiv, Odessa, Mykolaiv, and Dnipro. Another hint, perhaps, that if the war continues, these places too could become Russian targets. He adds, talks on Ukraine should be held between Russia and the US without any other Western countries participating. There is nothing to discuss with London or Brussels. And this sounds like a threat to Moldova. It cannot be excluded that the aggressive anti-Russian policy of Chisinau will lead to Moldova either becoming part of another state or will cease to exist. Also, we can see from Patrick.
So it's one thing after another, threatening this group and that group and the other group. And the goal seems to be to bring back the band, right? To get back to the glory of what was the USSR.
Of the kind of Europe that the Kremlin wants to deal with. Not Brussels and the EU, but individual pro-Moscow European countries. For a long time now, the EU leadership has had no right to speak on behalf of many of its members, like Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, Romania, and some other European countries that want stability in Europe and have a balanced view on relations with Russia.
And remember, to their mind, many of those countries, Slovakia and Hungary and Romania, were part of the Warsaw Pact that was kind of pulled into the Russian sphere willingly or mostly unwillingly.
Quite extraordinary, this suggestion that the only nations in Europe wanting stability are those that have good relations with a country whose large-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 created such instability in Europe. So to summarize, no hint of compromise, some veiled threats, and a determination to deal solely with the Trump administration on Europe.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing. Why deal solely with the U.S.? Because it's kind of like the U.S. USSR, where these are the two superpowers, and you know, this is like we're going to have that kind of summit. Putin still seems to think that that's the world that we live in, and he seems to be wanting to reconstitute it just a little bit more.
Ukraine. Plus, confidence in the Kremlin that under Donald Trump, the US will lose interest in the Ukraine war. Patrushev predicts Ukraine will not be a Trump priority. He's more concerned about China.
Now, that is true that Ukraine is second tier compared to China. I don't know that that's going to happen like he predicts, but that is the way that the Trump administration is oriented, at least at this point.
Well, we'll see if that is the case once Donald Trump is back in the White House. Meanwhile, this too caught my eye. In the same paper, a Russian MP, Anatoly Wasserman, has said the USSR may come back to life this year. He said there was a high possibility of it. We may manage to do this in 2025, the expert MP told journalists.
The USSR may come back to life this year. Well, that's certainly Putin's goal. Tell me what you think about this. Put that in the comments below. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.